In a room choked with power and arrogance, $1 billion deal was about to die. They never imagined the key to saving it wasn't a CEO or a banker, but the janitor in the corner, and the language he had kept silent for years. What he said next rewrote the rules of respect. Stay to see how quiet dignity can silence a room full of noise. In the quiet hum of a city that never slept, Elliot Barnes lived in a world defined by the sounds most people tuned out: the soft squeak of his cart's wheels on polished marble, the gentle hiss of a disinfectant spray bottle, the rhythmic thud of a mop head against linoleum. He was a man whose life had folded in on itself, becoming something smaller, quieter, and infinitely heavier than it once was. Each night, he put on the gray uniform of a luxury hotel janitor, a costume that rendered him invisible, a ghost who polished the fingerprints of the living from glass and steel. And each morning, he took it off to become the only fixed landmark in his daughter Charlotte's small, silent world. He was just a struggling single dad, a man trying to keep his head down and make it through another day. But have you ever felt like you were living someone else's life, just waiting for the story to remember your name? Charlotte, at 10, was a child made of stillness. Her silence wasn't empty. It was a deep reservoir of things felt, but not spoken. Since her mother, a woman who had been the vibrant melody of their lives, had faded into memory 2 years ago, words had become expensive treasures. Charlotte spent them sparingly, preferring to communicate through the careful, almost ceremonial placement of her toys, the unwavering intensity of her gaze, or the small warm pressure of her hand slipping into his. Elliot understood her language perfectly. It was a dialect of grief and hope, a syntax built from shared memories, and the unspoken promise to simply keep going. He had once been a man who lived and breathed the architecture of words. As a linguistics professor at Columbia, he could deconstruct a sentence into its atomic parts, trace a word's lineage through centuries of human history, and explain how language built entire worlds, entire realities. He taught his students that every language was a temple, a sacred structure holding the collective soul of a people. He could explain the subtle poetry of Japanese honorifics, the aggressive beauty of Germanic compound, nouns, the lyrical dance of Romance verb conjugations. His world had been one of sound, of meaning, of connection. Now his most important translation, his life's defining work, was deciphering the quiet weather of his daughter's heart. He didn't just see her silence, he heard it. He heard the questions she didn't ask, the fears she wouldn't voice, the love she couldn't articulate. He knew that the line of toy soldiers facing her bedroom door meant she was feeling anxious, and that the single teddy bear placed on her mother's empty pillow meant she was missing her with an ache that had no words. This was his life now. A quiet loop of mops and memories of polishing brass fixtures in a world of unimaginable wealth, while his own world was held together by the fragile threads of love and routine. He didn't mind the work. There was a certain dignity to it, a zen-like quality to restoring order in the quiet hours of the night. You don't mop because people notice, he often thought. You mop so they don't slip. It was honest work, a grounding force in a life that had been thrown into free fall. But sometimes in the dead of night, surrounded by the sleeping luxury of the hotel, he would feel a ghost of his old self, the professor stirring within him. A man who once commanded lecture halls now cleaned them. And he would wonder if this was it. If this was the final chapter of his story, a quiet epilogue written in the language of disinfectant and loss. He didn't know that his greatest lecture was yet to be given, not in a classroom, but in a lobby filled with a silence far more profound than his own. Reina Sato moved through the world inside a fortress of her own design. It was a structure of immense power, built from code and capital, with walls of polished glass and floors of cold, unforgiving marble. As the billionaire founder of Saito Dynamics, her name was a brand, her face a symbol of innovation, but the person Reina was an echo within the machine, a whisper in the silent corridors of her own life. What good is a fortress, after all, if you're the one trapped inside? She was in New York to finalize a merger that would reshape the landscape of global technology, a deal measured in billions of dollars and seismic shifts in power. She was surrounded by a team of sharp-suited American executives who orbited her like anxious moons, their movements quick, their voices loud. They spoke a language of leveraged buyouts and synergistic frameworks, a dialect of aggressive confidence that grated against her very nature. They believed leadership was about volume, about taking up space, about ensuring your voice was the last one heard. Raina's native tongue was one of subtlety of pauses that carried more weight than pronouncements. She understood, as her father had taught her, that what is not said, the ma, is often the most important part of the conversation. Her silence was not a void. It was a shield and a listening tool. It was where she processed, where she observed, where she found the truth that was often lost in the noise of words. In the grand lobby of the hotel, converted into a temporary boardroom, a standoff was brewing. The air was thick with the cold tension of a deal on the verge of collapse. On one side sat her Japanese partners, a trio of older traditional men from a firm her father had respected. Their faces were rigid, polite masks of impassivity, but she could read the unease in their posture, the slight tightening around their eyes. On the other side sat her American team, led by Marcus Thorne. Marcus, whose smile never reached his eyes, was growing visibly impatient. A crucial point of negotiation, a matter of deep cultural respect woven into the fabric of the contract's language, was being lost in translation. Marcus saw the Japanese team's hesitation not as a need for clarity, but as a weakness to be exploited. He saw their silence not as consideration, but as an obstacle. He leaned forward, raising his voice, breaking the delicate protocol of the moment. "I don't know what else to say," he exclaimed, his words clumsy and loud, each one a small stone thrown against the delicate glass of the negotiation. "We're offering them the world on a silver platter. It's a simple yes or no." He was wrong. It was never that simple. He was trying to drain a lake with a spoon, ignorant of the vast unseen depths beneath the surface. He was demanding a conclusion, while her partners were still carefully building the foundation of trust upon which any lasting agreement must stand. Raina watched her expression unreadable, a carefully composed mask of neutrality. But inside, she felt the familiar bitter chill of being profoundly misunderstood. She was a stranger in a room full of her own people, the architect of an empire who felt utterly powerless to bridge the silent, yawning gap between two worlds. The tension in the lobby had become a physical thing, a tightening in the air that Elliot could feel from across the vast, polished space as he wiped down a glass tabletop. He saw the flushed, angry faces of the American executives and the rigid, polite masks of the Japanese delegation. And he saw Reina Saito, a still point in the center of the storm, her hands resting in her lap, her silence a stark, powerful contrast to the rising volume around her. Marcus Thorne, frustrated, and out of his depth, finally threw his hands up in a gesture of dismissive surrender. "I don't know what else to say. We're offering them the world on a silver platter." It was then that Elliot did something he hadn't done in years. He broke the first rule of his job. He became visible. He stepped out of the background and into the story. Leaving his cart by a marble column, a silent testament to his station, he walked quietly towards the tense gathering. His movements were not bold, but measured and deliberate. The quiet footsteps of a man who understood the weight of presence. He didn't look at the executives. His focus was entirely on the elderly Japanese man at the head of the delegation, a man whose face was a carefully constructed fortress of dignity. In perfect formal Japanese, the respectful, nuanced keigo. He hadn't spoken since his wife was alive. Elliot bowed. It was a bow so slight it was almost imperceptible, a gesture of pure respect, not servitude. His voice when he spoke was soft, not the booming command of an executive, but the gentle, calming inquiry of a host. "Forgive my interruption," he said in Japanese, each word chosen with the precision of a poet. "But perhaps the language of business is too loud for this conversation. The air has become heavy. Would you do me the honor of allowing me to bring you some tea, Genmaicha, perhaps? It is a humble tea for grounding the spirit." A stunning, absolute silence fell over the table. The clicking of pens stopped. The shuffling of papers ceased. Marcus Thorne's mouth hung slightly open, his frustration replaced by pure, dumbfounded disbelief. The Japanese delegates stared at the man in the janitor's uniform, their eyes wide with shock, which then melted into a visible, profound relief. The tension in their shoulders eased. The rigid masks softened. They had been seen. They had been heard. Reina Saito's head lifted her gaze, locking onto Elliot for the first time. It was a look of startling intensity, a beam of light cutting through the fog. It wasn't just that he spoke her language. It was how he spoke it. He didn't just know the words. He understood the soul behind them, the deep cultural river of respect that flowed beneath the surface of the syllables. He hadn't offered a solution to the negotiation. He had offered a moment of peace. He had honored their need for harmony before business. In a room full of men trying to win, he was the only one who had tried to listen. And in that moment, Reina Saito, the woman who had built an impenetrable fortress around her heart, felt the first undeniable crack appear in the stone. The deal didn't close that day. Instead, it paused. The offer of tea had shifted the room's chemistry, replacing the brittle energy of aggression with a quiet, reflective curiosity. The Japanese delegation, their dignity restored, suggested they reconvene the following morning. For the first time in a week, the air felt like it had room to breathe. Later that evening, Reina Saito did something she never did. She sought someone out. Driven by a curiosity that felt both foreign and insistent, she walked the silent, carpeted corridors of the hotel. She found Elliot on the deserted third floor, standing on a small stepladder, carefully replacing a flickering light bulb in a wall sconce. He was absorbed in the simple, meticulous task, a portrait of quiet competence. She stood for a moment, just watching the man who had disarmed an entire boardroom with a few whispered words about tea. "Barnes-san," she said, her voice soft, careful not to startle him. Elliot turned, his expression one of polite surprise. He hadn't expected to ever speak to her again. He was the janitor. She was the billionaire. Their worlds were meant to be parallel lines, never intersecting. "Saito-sama," he replied, giving a slight respectful nod as he stepped down from the ladder. "I apologize if I overstepped earlier." Reina shook her head, a small definitive gesture. "You did not overstep. You created space." She paused, her gaze direct. "Where did a janitor learn to speak the language of my childhood with such understanding?" Elliot's gaze flickered for a moment, a shadow of his old life passing through his eyes, a life of tweed jackets and dusty chalkboards. "I used to teach," he said simply, his voice low. "A long time ago." He didn't elaborate, and she found herself respecting the boundary he drew around his past. She didn't press. Instead, she asked, "The tea you offered, Genmaicha, why that one?" He considered the question, his hands calloused from work resting at his sides. "It's made with roasted rice," he explained, his voice taking on the gentle didactic tone of a teacher. "It smells of the earth, of honest work, of something real. I thought it might remind everyone of the ground beneath their feet." Reina was silent for a long moment. She had spent a decade building an empire in the clouds, a digital fortress of algorithms and projections. And this man, this janitor, was talking about the ground. He saw things, not just the flickering bulb, but the quality of light. Not just the words, but the space between them. "I haven't had a real conversation in years." She admitted, the words escaping before her internal censor could catch them. "I attend meetings, I give directives, I sign more NDAs than birthday cards, but I don't talk. It was a confession, a raw, unvarnished truth offered up in a silent hallway. It was the first crack in the polished armor she wore every single day. He didn't offer sympathy or platitudes. He simply nodded, his expression one of quiet, profound understanding. Sometimes, he said, his words landing with gentle precision, the quietest people are the ones who have the most to say. The next day was a Saturday. Elliot's day off, a small island of quiet in the vast ocean of his week. He was at the park with Charlotte, a splash of green amidst the concrete canyons of the city. She wasn't on the swings or the slide. She was sitting on a bench, a sketch pad on her lap, drawing with a fierce concentration that was her signature. That's when he saw her. Reina Saito was standing near the entrance, looking profoundly out of place in an impeccably tailored cashmere coat, a stark figure of monochrome elegance against the chaotic, joyful color of the playground. She had found him. Not as a CEO seeking an employee, but as a person following a thread of curiosity she couldn't ignore. She approached slowly, as if not to startle a wild creature. Elliot introduced them simply, his voice calm. "Charlotte, this is Miss Saito. Miss Saito, this is my daughter Charlotte." Charlotte looked up from her drawing. Her gaze wasn't shy or intimidated. It was direct, unnervingly perceptive, the look of an old soul. She didn't say hello. She just watched Reina with an intensity that could make emperors nervous. Her silence a question mark hanging in the air. Reina, to her credit, didn't try to fill the silence with the cheap currency of pleasantries. She understood this was a sacred space governed by different rules. She simply sat on the other end of the bench, a respectful distance away, and waited. After a few minutes of quiet observation, Charlotte tore the page from her sketchbook. She walked over to Reina and held it out, a solemn offering. On the paper were two figures. One was a large, gentle-looking bear, colored in soft, earthy browns and grays. He was holding a bucket and mop, his expression one of quiet strength. The other figure was a butterfly hovering just above the bear's shoulder. It was exquisitely drawn, its wings a mosaic of vibrant colors, but they looked like they were made of shattered glass, beautiful but fragile. Reina took the drawing, her fingers tracing the delicate fractured lines of the butterfly's wings. She understood instantly, with a clarity that stole her breath. The bear was Elliot, strong, steady, a protector. And she was the butterfly, all delicate patterns and broken pieces trying to stay aloft. "She says butterflies are stars that remember how to move," Elliot said softly, translating one of the few poetic phrases Charlotte had ever spoken aloud, a line she had whispered months ago after watching a monarch land on her windowsill. Reina looked from the crayon drawing to the quiet child, and then back to the drawing. For the first time since her own father had died, she felt a profound, aching vulnerability that was both terrifying and liberating. Nothing, not a billion-dollar valuation, not a feature on the cover of Forbes, not the fawning praise of 1,000 sycophants, had ever made her feel more seen than this simple crayon sketch from a little girl who refused to speak. It was a language beyond words, a pure, unfiltered truth that had bypassed all her defenses and touched the very core of her being. In the silent language of a child's art, she had been truly, completely, and irrevocably understood. The story, when it broke, did so like a tidal wave. A freelance journalist who had been in the lobby that day, quietly observing the corporate theater, sensed a deeper narrative. He started digging. The resulting article, published on a popular online news platform, had a headline that was simply irresistible: "The Janitor and the Billionaire, the Man Who Spoke Her Silence." The piece went viral overnight. It was shared, commented on, and translated across the globe. It wasn't just about the novelty of a janitor speaking fluent formal Japanese. It was about the symbolism. The humble, unseen worker who possessed a quiet dignity and cultural fluency that the powerful, slickly dressed executives utterly lacked. The story resonated with a deep collective hunger for authenticity in a world of performance. Elliot Barnes was no longer invisible. His quiet life was shattered by the roar of public attention. Reporters camped outside his modest apartment building in Queens. News vans with satellite dishes idled on his street, their presence a jarring intrusion into the neighborhood's quiet rhythm. His past life was unearthed and laid bare for the world to see. Elliot Barnes, the brilliant grieving linguistics professor from Columbia University, who had walked away from a distinguished academic career after his wife's tragic death to devote himself to raising his daughter. The narrative was powerful, a modern-day fable of integrity over ambition. To the world, he was a hero, a symbol of quiet strength and paternal devotion. But to Marcus Thorne and the rest of Raina's corporate team, he was something else entirely. He was a threat, a complication. A janitor had stolen the spotlight and in their eyes made them look like incompetent fools. The media frenzy was a fire they couldn't control, and it was beginning to cast long, dark shadows on the precious multi-billion-dollar merger. Their carefully crafted narrative of corporate strength and savvy negotiation was being overwritten by a story about human connection, about a single act of kindness. And they could not allow it. The pressure on Raina to distance herself, to dismiss Elliot as a fluke, was immense. The board of directors was panicking. The investors were calling. Marcus Thorne argued relentlessly in closed-door meetings that Elliot was a liability, a loose thread that could unravel everything. "He's a distraction, Raina." Marcus insisted, his voice sharp with frustration. "We need to control the narrative. We need to frame this as what it was, a minor, insignificant event. We thank him for his service. We give him a nice severance package, and he disappears. The story dies." But the story wasn't dying. It was growing. And Raina knew that what Marcus was asking her to do wasn't just to dismiss an employee. He was asking her to erase a moment of genuine human connection. He was asking her to betray the man who had, with a simple cup of tea, reminded her what it felt like to be understood. She was at a crossroads with the weight of her empire on one side and the quiet truth of what she had felt in that lobby on the other. Marcus Thorne decided to handle the Elliot problem himself. His strategy wasn't a direct, clumsy attack, but a subtle, polished act of public betrayal designed to reframe the narrative and seize back control. He arranged an exclusive primetime interview with a major business network, ostensibly to discuss the merger's final stages. Raina, as the face of Cytodynamics, was contractually obligated to attend. The trap was set in a sterile television studio, under the cold, unblinking glare of hot lights and robotic cameras. The air hummed with the low frequency of broadcast technology. Marcus began by praising Raina's vision, his words smooth and practiced. He spoke of synergy and shareholder value, the sterile language of his world. Then, with the skill of a seasoned predator, he pivoted. "Of course," he said to the interviewer, his tone dripping with a false condescending sincerity, "this recent media distraction has been interesting. It's a heartwarming little story, to be sure. A man sees an opportunity for a bit of limelight and takes it. We admire that kind of ambition in its own way." The implication was a poisoned dart wrapped in silk. Elliot wasn't a hero. He was an opportunist. A clever janitor who had used a moment of corporate tension to angle for his 15 minutes of fame, perhaps even a hefty payout. Marcus was painting him as a calculating schemer. He then turned to Raina, his smile a tight predatory slash. "Raina, you've built an empire on your uncanny ability to see through people, to gauge their true motivations. You must have recognized this man was simply playing a part, hoping to capitalize on your company's generosity. It was a brilliant, cruel move." He was painting Raina into a corner. She could either agree with him, dismissing Elliot and appearing as the sharp, ruthless CEO her board wanted her to be, or she could defend the janitor and risk looking naive, emotional, and unfit to lead a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. He was trying to erase the authenticity of the moment in the lobby, to drain it of its meaning and reduce it to a cynical, grubby transaction. He was forcing her to choose her company's pristine, powerful image or the quiet, profound dignity of the janitor who had shown her a kindness she hadn't realized she was starving for. All she had to do was agree. A simple nod. A polite, non-committal answer like, "Mr. Barnes performed his duties admirably," and the problem would be contained. The story would die, and the world would move on. The camera zoomed in on her face, waiting. The entire world, it seemed, was holding its breath. What would she choose, the fortress or the feeling? Raina looked at Marcus's smug, expectant face, then at the camera's unflinching red light. The world was watching, waiting for her to restore order, to put the janitor back in his place, and reaffirm the cold calculus of power. She could feel the immense weight of her board, her investors, her entire empire pressing down on her. And in that moment, an image flashed in her mind, clear and vivid. A crayon drawing of a butterfly with wings made of shattered glass. She thought of the earthy, grounding smell of roasted rice tea. She thought of a quiet man in a gray uniform who had seen her, not her title, not her net worth. She turned back to the interviewer, her expression serene, her voice perfectly calm, devoid of anger or agitation. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it landed in the soundproofed studio with the force of a thunderclap. Marcus Thorne's smirk faltered. The interviewer blinked. "You are mistaken." "Marcus," Raina continued, her gaze steady. "Mr. Barnes was not playing a part. In a room full of performances, he was the only person being genuine." She paused, letting the silence stretch a tool she now wielded with newfound precision. "You see, for years I have been surrounded by people who speak my language but do not understand my silence. Mr. Barnes, who had every reason to remain silent, whose very job is to be invisible, chose to speak, not for ambition, not for gain, but for the sake of understanding." She leaned forward slightly, her focus shifting from Marcus to the camera, speaking now to the millions watching. "My company Cytodynamics was built on innovation, but innovation without humanity is just a faster way to lose our way. It does not need leaders who are fluent in intimidation. It needs people who are fluent in respect." Her gaze was piercing, holding the lens captive. "Mr. Barnes taught my entire executive team a lesson that day, a lesson about dignity. He reminded us that sometimes the most valuable person in the room isn't the one with the loudest voice, but the one with the courage to listen." She delivered the final lines with a quiet, unshakable finality. "He isn't a liability to my company. He is the standard to which we should now aspire." The silence that followed was the loudest thing the studio had ever heard. It was the sound of a narrative being rewritten. It was the sound of an empire changing its foundation, shifting from the cold marble of profit to the solid ground of principle. It was the sound of a butterfly remembering it was not made of glass, but of stars that had simply forgotten how to move. And in that moment, Raina Sato wasn't just a CEO. She was a leader. The fallout from the interview was immediate and seismic. Marcus Thorne was fired before the evening news cycle had even finished. The story of Raina's quiet, decisive stand exploded this time, not just as a heartwarming human interest piece, but as a viral business case study on a new kind of leadership, one rooted in integrity, not intimidation. The merger, once threatened by the controversy, was now galvanized. Raina's Japanese partners, moved by her public display of principle, expressed a newfound profound respect for her leadership. The deal was signed not with a sense of corporate conquest, but of mutual earned trust. 2 weeks later, Raina held a press conference in the hotel's grand ballroom, the same space where the story had begun. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. She didn't just announce the successful historic merger. She announced something more. Cytodynamics was founded on the principle that technology should connect us. She began, her voice calm and clear. But I have learned recently that the most important connections are not digital. They are human. and they are often built in the quiet spaces in the languages of respect and understanding that we have forgotten how to speak. She paused, taking a sip of water. That is why today I am announcing the creation of the Sado Barnes Foundation. A wave of murmurs swept through the room. It will be a multi-million-dollar global initiative dedicated to funding cross-cultural education and linguistic programs in underprivileged schools. Its mission is simple: to build bridges, not walls, to teach our children that listening is more powerful than speaking. She smiled, a genuine warm smile that lit up her entire face. And I am honored to announce its first executive director, a man uniquely qualified to understand the space between words and the profound importance of dignity, Professor Elliot Barnes. She gestured to the side of the stage, and Elliot walked out to join her at the podium. He wasn't wearing a janitor's uniform or a professor's tweed jacket. He was just wearing a simple, well-fitting suit. He didn't look like a hero or a victim or a symbol. He just looked like himself. He spoke briefly, his voice steady and clear, carrying the quiet authority of a man who knows his own worth. Language is not just a tool for communication, he said, his eyes scanning the room. It is a shelter, a place we can build for each other. Sometimes the most important work is not building something new, but simply making room inside the shelters we already have. He wasn't just accepting a job. He was stepping back into the life he thought he had lost forever. He was not reclaiming the past, but building a different, more meaningful future from its foundations. He was no longer invisible. He was a landmark. That night, after the whirlwind of the press conference had finally subsided, Elliot found Raina on the hotel rooftop. It was a space designed for elevated conversations, high above the noise and judgment of the world below. The city glittered beneath them, a silent, sprawling galaxy of a million other stories. She wasn't wearing her usual armor of silk and steel. She was in a simple, soft-looking gray sweater, the collar turned up against the cool night air. She looked less like a brand and more like a person. "Are you sure about this, Raina?" he asked quietly, standing beside her at the railing. Giving a janitor a multi-million-dollar foundation. She turned to him, a small, real smile gracing her lips for the first time he could remember. "I'm not giving a foundation to a janitor, Elliot. I'm giving it to the smartest, most decent man I know." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, the kind of easy, unburdened silence they had come to share. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything they didn't need to say. "My father used to say that a company is like a tree," Raina said, her voice barely a whisper against the vastness of the night. "Everyone admires the branches heavy with fruit and the beautiful leaves that change with the seasons. But they forget the roots. The roots are what hold everything up, working in the dark, unseen. You are like the roots, Elliot." He looked at her, at the woman who had lived her life in a glass fortress, high in the clouds, now speaking of the earth. He saw the flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, the same vulnerability he had seen in the park. He reached out, not to hold her, not to take anything, but to gently brush a stray strand of hair from her cheek. It was a simple, tender gesture, an act of quiet care. "You're not a butterfly made of glass, Raina," he said softly, his voice full of a warmth he hadn't realized he still possessed. "You just forgot how strong your wings were." In that quiet moment on the rooftop, under a vast, silent sky, they were no longer a billionaire and a janitor. They were no longer defined by their titles or their pasts. They were just Elliot and Raina, two people who had found in each other's quiet strength a place to finally safely land. The slow burn of respect and recognition, which had started with a polite bow and a cup of tea, had finally kindled into something that felt unmistakably, terrifyingly like hope. 6 months later, the world looked different. The light filtering through the window of Elliot's small apartment seemed warmer, softer. It was a Saturday morning, and the air was filled not with the quiet, heavy weight of grief, but with the warm, sweet smell of pancakes and the sound of soft, easy laughter. Raina was there sitting at the small wobbly kitchen table that had seen so many silent meals. She had a faint smudge of flour on her cheek, a tiny imperfection that made her more beautiful than any magazine cover ever could. She was wearing one of Elliot's old faded gray university sweatshirts, the fabric soft from 1,000 washes. The armor was gone. She was helping Charlotte, who stood on a stool carefully pouring batter onto a hot griddle. Her movements were no longer hesitant, but confident and sure. And Charlotte was talking. Not a lot, not a torrent of words, but a steady, happy stream of observations about the shapes the pancakes were making. One looked like a cat with a lopsided ear, another a 5-pointed star. Her voice, once a rare and precious commodity, was now the gentle bubbling soundtrack of their morning. Elliot stood at the stove flipping the pancakes, his heart, a thing he could feel again inside his chest, full and light and impossibly warm. He looked at this scene at the woman he was falling in love with, and the daughter who was finding her voice again, and felt a wave of gratitude so powerful it almost buckled his knees. This was their new life, a mosaic built from broken pieces, something more beautiful for having been shattered first. It was imperfect and messy, and utterly breathtakingly real. They were not a perfect family, not by any conventional definition. But they were a found one, built on a foundation of shared silence and earned trust. Home wasn't a penthouse overlooking the park or a modest apartment in Queens. Home was this. This small, sun-drenched circle of warmth, these mismatched plates, this feeling of belonging that was stronger than any fortress walls. Raina caught his eye and smiled a genuine, unguarded smile that reached all the way to her eyes and transformed her face. He didn't have to say anything. She didn't have to say anything. They had learned to speak the language that existed beyond words, the profound, simple grammar of presence, the quiet promise that said, "I am here. You are safe. We are home." As they sat down to eat at the small table, a little island in the sun, Charlotte carefully separated one perfectly golden pancake from the stack. She held it up on her fork, a small, solemn offering. "This one is for Mommy," she said, her voice clear and steady without a trace of the hesitation that had once clouded her words. "So she knows we're okay." Elliot's eyes filled with tears, but they were not the hot, sharp tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming gratitude. He looked at his daughter, this brave, wise little soul, who had navigated the depths of her grief in silence and emerged into the light, and he felt a love so vast it was almost painful. Across the table, Raina reached out and placed her hand over his, her touch warm and firm. It was a quiet promise, a vow of shared witness. Later, after the plates were cleared and the small kitchen was tidy, they sat together on the sofa, a comfortable, easy tangle of arms and legs. The late afternoon sun streamed through the window, casting long golden shadows on the floor. Charlotte nestled between them, leaned her head against Raina's shoulder, a gesture of complete, unconditional trust. She looked up at her father, then at Raina, her expression thoughtful. "You know," she said, her voice filled with the simple, unassailable wisdom of a child, "love is the loudest thing silence can hold." And in that moment, the profound, simple truth of her words settled over them, the final, perfect piece of their story. It was the key that unlocked everything, the melody that resolved the dissonant chords of their pasts into a beautiful, harmonious whole. Because some stories don't end with a grand crescendo or a dramatic finale. They resolve into a quiet, beautiful chord that continues to resonate long after the music has stopped. Theirs was a story that had begun with a respectful whisper and had healed in a shared silence. It was a testament to the quiet heroes, the unseen people holding up the world. It was proof that the most powerful connection isn't always about what is said, but about what is finally truly and deeply understood. They had found a home not in a place, but in the silence. They shared a silence that was now filled with the loudest and most beautiful sound of all. Thank you for watching Second Chance Hearts. We're so grateful to have you in our growing community of dreamers and believers. What did you think of Elliot and Raina's story? Did a moment speak to your heart? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. If you believe that kindness is a language everyone understands, don't forget to subscribe to Second Chance Hearts and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and keep believing in the quiet miracles that are all around us.